So welcome everybody to this new DaSCI seminar. Today's speaker is Professor Sandra González-Bailón. She is the Caroline Marvin Professor of Communication at the Annenberg School for Communication and Director of the Center for Information Networks and Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. She also has a secondary appointment in the Department of Sociology at the same institution. And prior to joining Penn from 2008 to 2013, she was a research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute. She completed her PhD at the University of Oxford and her undergraduate studies at the University of Barcelona. Her research agenda lies at the intersection of computational social science and political communication, including how online networks shape exposure to information and how we think about political engagement, mobilization dynamics, information diffusion, and the consumption of news. Her articles have appeared in scientific journals like Science and Nature, among others, and today's talk will be focused on social and algorithmic choices in the transmission of misinformation. I want to thank again Professor González-Bailón for very kindly accepting our invitation, and whenever you're ready, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Pablo, for the invitation and for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here virtually. I wish I could meet you all in person, but maybe one day. So I'm going to talk about social and algorithmic choices in the transmission of misinformation. And inevitably, this means that I have to talk about content moderation, because content moderation is the main strategy to fight misinformation online. And so I wanted to start by first clarifying what I mean by content moderation, which really is a combination of automated, recently AI-driven decisions and human decisions. So content moderation essentially refers to a process that involves reviewing and removing, reducing, and labeling content that violates a platform's set of guidelines or policies. Usually this takes the form of some sort of message that pops up on your screen when you're trying to access some content, either to tell you that the content has been removed or that it contains false information. But it also manifests in more opaque ways through the algorithms that determine which information is more visible on your feed. And this is what the reducing part refers to, right? The demotion of content that is deemed to be violating community guidelines or policies so that fewer people see it. Now, on the one hand, content moderation is intended to protect online safety, preserve some modicum of truth-seeking, and essentially ensure that the users have a positive experience. So we expect platforms to have content moderation policies of some sort, ideally defined in such a way that it scales. On the other hand, it also encompasses a wide range of practices that platforms can use to control information flows. And so this opens an area of great power and influence and very little accountability, because the truth is that there is not that much transparency on how content moderation operates within platforms. And so I am going to spend the next 3 minutes or so trying to motivate why the question of why content moderation matters from a large picture perspective. I promise I'm going to get to data analysis and technical details very soon, so please bear with me. To give you a sense of some of the stakes that are involved when we talk about content moderation, I want to remind you of 2 incidents that occurred last summer very close to each other. One is that Pavel Durov, the CEO of the social media platform Telegram, which is known for its light touch content moderation policies, he was arrested in France and indicted, indicted of charges. This is the allergy. Springtime is terrible in Philadelphia. Anyway, he was arrested in France and indicted on charges that included the distribution of illegal content. And this essentially refers to really illegal content like drug trafficking or child pornography. Another incident is the blocking of X from Brazil after Elon Musk failed to comply with court orders to suspend certain accounts also deemed illegal. And so, there are 200 million people in Brazil who suddenly couldn't use X. In both instances, the CEOs ended up, they are very vocal defenders of free speech. In both instances, both CEOs ended up folding and agreeing to revise their content moderation policies. But these incidents highlighted two things. One is that insufficient content moderation can get you in trouble. And the second is that content moderation, again, it gives platforms the power to control speech and how information flows. Another thing that these incidents showed is that governments are increasingly willing to intervene. In the cases I just gave, it is France and Brazil, but more generally in Europe, as you may know, there are regulatory efforts to make social media companies more accountable. The Digital Services Act, for instance, requires platforms to be transparent in their content moderation, and it sets rules to ensure that there is transparency in content moderation decisions. And so what all of these manifests is that there are growing anxieties about the global power of platforms, as it was nicely discussed in this relatively recent New Yorker piece, but also that there are tensions between free speech and what it takes to protect democracies, knowing that governments themselves are not necessarily always on the right side of things. Fast forward, and soon we are in a situation in which most social media platforms decide to dial back their content moderation efforts in the name of free speech, right? So following changes that Elon Musk had already made in X, Mark Zuckerberg recently decided to discontinue Meta's fact-checking partnership and rely instead on community notes. And so essentially, it's up to users, it's up to us to decide what needs to be debunked. And very briefly, let me just say as an aside that there is some irony in the fact that Meta is so fervently defending free speech while also trying to prevent the circulation of a recently published book written by a former high-rank global policy director. This book came out a few weeks ago. I read it in 2 days, and among many other things, what the book does is offer a very eye-opening account of how content moderation decisions were made inside the company. And so, should you be interested in learning more, you should know that Facebook doesn't want you to buy this book or read it. In any case, stepping back, the importance of content moderation speaks to the larger importance that the circulation of information has for democracies, right? Information and misinformation have always played a role in democratic systems, especially if we take this kind of epistemic conception of democracies, according to which the quality of our democracies relies on the quality of the information that we consume. There is a lot of talk these days and for the past few years about how digital technologies are challenging the foundations of democracy. The truth is that communication technologies have always challenged our normative expectations of the role of information, or the role that information should play in democratic systems, right? Communication technologies have long provided a broadcasting platform to propaganda efforts. They have allowed the substitution of high-quality news with low-quality content, and in general, they have helped instill priorities in the mind of the public that do not always align with what's of public interest. So this has always been an issue. But what is true is that digital technologies and social media in particular, with their newsfeed algorithms, they have created a new category of challenges. And the ease with which misinformation can now be produced and disseminated is prominent amongst these challenges. Social media have eroded one of the most important mechanisms through which traditional news media enforce political accountability by blurring the boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate information and between credible and unreliable sources, right? These on the screen are very few examples of the many research articles that have tried to characterize in recent years the sorts of information disorders that are challenging the democratic process, including the spread of rumors or the spread of misinformation, and that have tried to provide solutions and suggestions on how to address this problem. In general, there are two streams of research that try to address this challenge, the challenge of misinformation. One stream focuses on the individual and on how to increase resistance to false information through media literacy or other types of interventions like psychological inoculation, or pre-bunking, which is about anticipating false claims and providing accurate information to counter those claims. Another stream of research takes a more systemic view to characterize the supply of problematic content and how that content is presented to people. And this includes processes of algorithmic amplification and more generally the formation of audiences enabled by platform design. And so the work that I want to discuss in this talk follows this second stream of research, essentially. What follows in this talk, I'm gonna divide what I want to discuss in three parts. In the first part, I will talk about the supply and demand of misinformation, and I will discuss a pattern that empirical research has identified over and over, and that is the pattern of asymmetrical engagement with misinformation, asymmetrical in ideological terms, and how algorithmic forms of curation are amplifying that asymmetry. In the second part, I will talk about the conditions under which misinformation propagates to reach millions. And here I want to emphasize the importance of technological affordances or technological design to understand how misinformation diffuses. And then in the last part, I'm going to discuss the impact that content moderation policies can have on the virality and the reach of misinformation and of any type of information considered problematic. And this is the part in which I will discuss the lack of transparency in how platforms decide to implement those policies. And then to close the presentation and maybe give some pointers for discussion, I will summarize some of the problems that the field of misinformation research still faces today as we gear up to the AI era in which content can be produced more easily, much faster, and in larger volumes. All right, so the first part is about the prevalence and the demand for misinformation. The problem of misinformation has two elements to it, right? One element refers to the supply of information, and the focus here is prevalence, or how common misinformation is. Understanding this element requires adopting sort of the bird's eye view and analyzing on the aggregate how much misinformation there is out there. The other element refers to the demand side of the equation, and it is about exposure and susceptibility. In other words, it is about the what kinds of audiences are more likely to consume misinformation and engage with it. And so again, on the aggregate, the idea is that we can identify patterns of groups that systematically gravitate towards problematic content. These are a couple of examples of research that has tried to assess the prevalence of misinformation on social media. So for instance, this network figure comes from a paper that was published in 2019, analyzing misinformation during the 2016 presidential election. The network measures co-exposure to news on Twitter before it became X. Each node represents a political news site, and the color, in particular the orange color, encodes fake news. So essentially what the analysis of this network revealed is that fake news sources have a very niche interest, right? Like users exposed to this type of information were a minority of heavily overlapping individuals. And so when we look at the prevalence of news and false stories, we can identify patterns like these, right? We can identify pockets of unreliable news sources and also who is more likely to gravitate towards those sources at the population level. Now, of course, the big question here is, can we generalize these findings across political contexts and across time? Now, surely things have changed since 2016, including how X operates. Then there is the question of susceptibility and exposure, and the demographic correlates that explain who is more likely to engage with political misinformation. And so, for instance, in this article that was published in Science Advances in 2021, the authors provide evidence that conservatives perform worse at distinguishing truths from falsehoods, right? And this is partly because the most widely shared falsehoods promote conservative positions. And so, this is not only a story about susceptibility, but it's also a story about supply. So how much content it is being supplied that doesn't meet the standards of truth, essentially. And so again, supply and demand are in constant interaction. You cannot understand one without understanding the other, even if often, for convenience, we break this feedback loop apart to be able to run our experiments or design our research in a feasible manner. And yet this interaction between supply and demand is not the only feedback loop that is beating at the heart of the information ecosystem, right? There is another loop matching individuals to content, and that is the curation loop, right? So the process by which individuals are presented with a subset of all the information they could see, in a process that learns from how individuals engage with that information so that in the next iteration, it incorporates that knowledge into making new selections or new recommendations. And so in this process, both social choices and algorithmic systems play a role. Social and algorithmic forms of curation allow us to select and organize information. And what matters is that this process often results in different information realities for different people. And as part of this process, it also often results, as an unintended consequence, perhaps, this also often results in an asymmetric amplification of content. There is research suggesting, for instance, that when it comes to political content and political news, there is an asymmetry in terms of political bias, right? There is more content that leans right in the ideological spectrum than content leaning left. And so the question is why? Is it because of mechanisms like algorithmic amplification, or is it because of social mechanisms like selective exposure, meaning people want to read what they already agree with, or because of supply volumes, meaning that there is simply a media machine that is creating more information on one side of the ideological spectrum than on the other? And so the answer to this question, right, of what's more important, the social or the technological, the answer to this question is both. Both are equally important. In a way, technologies echo... Sorry? Okay, so in a way, technologies echo the old sociological tension between structure and agency, and that's the question of, sort of, do people jump or are they pushed? It turns out that it is a little bit of both. And this is what we showed in this research that was published last year. This is what we showed in this article that was published in Science, where we looked at exposure to political news and to misinformation around the 2020 election. We showed that there is a social component and an algorithmic component in how we build our information realities online. What was unique about this research is that we had access to the inventory of content that users on the platform could have seen, absent the newsfeed, right? So sort of absent the selection of content that drives the newsfeed, given the supply offered by users and through pages and groups, right? This inventory is a universe of content from which a selection is then displayed in users' feeds. And so it is in this process of going from the inventory to the feed that we see the mediation of the algorithms, right? Algorithms decide what to show to users. And this is what we call algorithmic curation. Of course, then users decide what they want to engage with by liking it, by responding to it, or by resharing it, right? And this is how social curation happens. The generation of signals of what is of interest to users, the algorithms will pick up and use in the next iteration of recommendations. And so in the paper, we call this the funnel of engagement. So this is a set of mechanisms that end up creating the different information realities that different users inhabit. One of the things that we looked at are the audiences of misinformation. This is the figure that we present in the paper, but I'm going to show you another figure that was part of journalistic coverage because I think it's more intuitive. So what we do in this figure essentially is analyze the audience composition of misinformation posts. These are density plots, and one of the striking results is that about 97% of false news content on Facebook during the 2020 election period, which is the data that we analyze here, they had audiences that were conservative, predominantly conservative. This finding was supported by this other more recent paper from another team of researchers, independent from us, that used a different data set. In this case, it wasn't Facebook, it was Twitter data. And they also find that conservatives shared more false claims than liberals, right? And what is new about this paper is that in addition to using professional fact-checker ratings to identify problematic content, which is what we did in our research, in addition to also using those ratings, they also use lay people's labels, right? So using a politically balanced group of respondents, they ask them, so do you think this is true or false? And their results are consistent, right? It doesn't matter if you're using professional fact checkers or lay people, essentially the asymmetry remains, right? There is more false content that is favored by conservative audiences. And the fact that they use these two ways of evaluating content helps alleviate the concern that fact checkers are politically biased, which is one of the responses that you usually get when you're using the ratings to identify problematic content. All right, so this is the end of the first part of my talk about the prevalence and demand for misinformation. I'm going to start now with the second part, which is about diffusion and how the design of platforms shape the way in which information or misinformation circulates. And here I'm going to draw mostly from a paper that was published very recently, last December. In this paper, which is also part of this collaboration that allowed us to look into unprecedented data from Meta. In this paper, we consider how changes in content moderation policies shifted the way in which information, including the content that had been fact-checked as false, moved within the platform. So our main goal here when designing this study was to be able to answer this one main question, which is how did content diffuse on the platform? And the answer to this question relies on us being able to reconstruct the cascading behavior triggered by the ability to reshare content. And so, you know, you see something on your feed, you click on the share button, one of your friends sees your reshare, they click on the share button, and this unfolds a chain reaction that we can analyze as a network object, right? And so each of these diffusion events is an object of study. And in particular, in this paper, each of these diffusion events is our unit of analysis. So in total, we analyzed more than 1 billion posts shared by more than 100 million users during the months preceding and following the 2020 election. Unfortunately, we couldn't do this again for the 2024 election because Meta did not continue this research collaboration. But I think we can still learn something meaningful, even if we're talking about one electoral period prior to the most recent one. What we wanted to do with this data was to locate each of the diffusion events that unfolded on the platform in a possibility space that is defined essentially by two metrics, the depth and the breadth of the diffusion trees. That is, by how deep and how wide these diffusion trees grew. This is the observed distribution. Dashed lines indicate the median. And so basically the bottom, kind of the high level message from this figure is that out of the 1 billion posts that we analyzed, only about 1% is reshared more than 100 times. So, you know, most of the things that get published on social media, and this is something that, you know, we kind of knew already, but it's striking to see how little the fraction of content that gets posted on social media actually grows enough to be considered viral. The vast majority of posts of these diffusion events, they don't grow very much. But of course, when they do, they reach millions. And those are the kind of the instances that are very salient in our minds and that are usually get covered by journalists and by the media in general. One of the things that we wanted to do with this analysis was differentiate between broadcasting, which is when the trees grow very wide but are very shallow, and viral spreading, which is when diffusion generates narrow but very deep transmission paths. And we wanted to analyze these differences, taking into account who is at the root of the tree. And there are three ways of initiating a diffusion event on Meta, like certainly in 2020. One is through users' profiles. The other is through pages, which is the typical mechanism for celebrities, brands, media outlets, but also politicians to share content. And then through groups, which users can join to connect to other users who are like-minded in some dimension. And the reason why we paid attention to these three surfaces is because we wanted to connect diffusion dynamics that are endogenous to this platform with design choices. At the end of the day, it is a design choice to introduce affordances like pages that allow you to post content that millions of people can see, which is something that is not possible through our personal profiles because the number of friends you can accumulate is capped, right? So the first thing we saw is that pages initiate most of the large trees in our data, including trees diffusion events that are classified as political, but misinformation trees reverse the trends, right? So if, in the case of misinformation, what we see is that these large diffusion trees are predominantly initiated by users. And so this is our first indication that content moderation was targeting predominantly pages and groups. And I'm going to say a little bit more on this later. But so there were attempts at controlling how information was flowing on the platform. Those attempts took the shape of content moderation policies, and those policies targeted predominantly two of the three surfaces, pages and groups. And we see here the implications of that targeting. Another thing that we saw is that misinformation grew through depth, not breadth. So it grew virally from person to person, not through broadcasting, which is what typically happens when a celebrity or a politician with a large following posts something and then immediately lots of people, thousands of even millions sometimes, they repost. But then the trail dies off, right? And so when it comes to misinformation, the growth mechanism is peer-to-peer. It's like these trees grow with very deep but very narrow branches. And again, we see that misinformation trees are generated mostly by older conservative users. So the figure in panel A is essentially the same figure that I showed you with the previous paper. The difference is that here we are not just tracking news content, which was the focus on that prior paper. Here we are actually analyzing every single post that was reshared at least once. This includes news, but it includes lots of other content, memes, whatever. And so it doesn't matter. They will still see this striking asymmetry in who is engaging the most with misinformation. And they are the conservative audiences, also older audiences, which is not surprising considering that Facebook is not the platform of preference for the younger users. And then we also show that misinformation trees grow more slowly, partly because they take more time to travel through these deep and narrow branches, but they also attain depth faster at about double speed compared to non-misinformation trees. And I'm highlighting this here because this finding really contradicts prior research on misinformation diffusion on Twitter. Maybe some of you remember this paper that was published in 2018, which provided evidence that false news travels faster than true stories. This is definitely not what we found in the context of the 2020 election. And the reason is because of content moderation, right? Like, information does not travel through these platform networks uncontrolled. And the whole point of our research was to try to gain some transparency as to what the measures for controlling these flows of information were in 2020. So now I'm entering the third part of the talk, which is where I consider in more detail how platform policies shape information flows. So again, so here the question, if you remember what I said before, that one question of interest was, okay, so how does information travel through these networks? Here the question is whether content moderation as a form of platform intervention can create firewalls that prevent the spread of content, and whether it can do so effectively. Note that this is different from algorithmic curation, right? The process that I mentioned before about how algorithmic systems choose what to show us on the feed, on our screens. These algorithms, as far as we can tell, because there's not a ton of transparency about this, but so essentially, as far as we can tell, these algorithms have processes to demote content that is deemed problematic. So this is the part of the integrity process that appears halfway through this image here, through the funneling of content. So for instance, if a post is rated false, or at least this was true in 2020, it's not true anymore, but if a post is rated false by third-party fact checkers, the algorithm will move it lower according to some parameters in users' feeds. These days, it's mostly community nodes. It's unclear whether they are effective. But essentially, we know that the feed algorithm is a content curation engine that influences what people see and ultimately what people engage with, including resharing, which is the main mechanism for the growth of diffusion trees. But when we talk about content moderation, we talk about other things in addition to the feed algorithm, right? The feed algorithm is not the only thing that mattered during the 2020 elections for sure, but in general, in most platforms, the feed algorithm is not the only thing that matters, right? In the context of the 2020 elections, we know, mostly thanks to leaked reports like the January 6th House Committee social media report, but also through journalistic coverage, we know that at specific times around Election Day and January 6th, Meta launched a number of interventions known as break the glass measures, which, as the name suggests, are essentially emergency measures implemented to control how information was circulating on the platform. And so these are measures that went above and beyond what the feed algorithm usually does. And they were actually implemented in a rather half-assertive way. Like, it wasn't one measure implemented on one day. It was rather a very complex set of measures that were implemented at different points in time with different degrees of intensity. And so based on these reports, we reconstructed a timeline of interventions with the dates when these break the glass measures were launched and then rolled back and then launched again and then rolled back again. During our observation window, which starts in July of 2020 and ends in early February of 2021, there are 2 periods where different break the glass measures were implemented, each at different times, as I said, and to different degrees depending on the day, because these measures weren't launched simultaneously. As we document in the paper, the first period of intense platform interventions started in early October and ended in early December. And then there was a second period which started in early January, but it intensified around January 6th and ended at the end of the month. And so essentially what this means is that we have different information regimes in our data, right? We have periods of newsfeed as usual, and then we have periods of extraordinary break-the-glass interventions. And so to go back to this question of how content moderation policies alter diffusion dynamics, what we decided to do is compare the structure and the growth of diffusion trees across the 4 different intervention periods, right? We have 2 periods of low intensity content moderation, and then we have 2 periods of high intensity content moderation, which is when these break the glass measures were operating. Just in terms of volume, we identified definite changes in the number of diffusion events, right? So here we are counting the number of trees with at least 100 shares over time. Shadowed in gray, we have the 2 intervention periods that we define as high intensity per the intervention's timeline. And so there are several high-level kind of messages we can draw from this figure, right? One is that there is a substantive decline, about 30% in the number of large trees in general, but this decline is significantly bigger for misinformation trees, where the counts get really close to the 0 line just before election day, and this is definitely not organic. This is not an organic decline. And it is also apparent, if only descriptively, that the first high intervention period coincides with the sharpest decline in political and misinformation trees. We also see that the structure of diffusion trees varies significantly across intervention periods, especially so for misinformation and political trees. And so these break-the-glass measures resulted in a shortening of the tails of the distributions of these trees. Now, to put this in context, one of these break-the-glass measures was called virality circuit breaker. And so the name is pretty graphic. And what we see here is that these measures did act as a circuit breaker, and it kind of cut down it prevented the growth of these diffusion events. And then in terms of reach, so the number of people who actually saw the content, right? Like most people online are lurkers. Most people do not engage by resharing anything, but they still see the content. And so this is what we're measuring here, the actual number of people or views that this content collected. And so what we see here is that there is a steady decline in the reach of large misinformation trees, going from having about 50 million views at the start of the observation period to, again, close to zero just before November 3rd, before Election Day. And so misinformation views, what we see here, also visibly increased over the weeks after the break-the-glass measures were rolled back after the election. And this increase is mostly driven by a surge in the number of large trees initiated by users. And so what we conclude from this is that there were these content moderation policies in place intended to curtail the flow of misinformation, which is good if we agree that misinformation is bad for democracy. But at the same time, the fact that users were so instrumental in still facilitating the diffusion of misinformation suggests that they created an enforcement gap in the application of these policies, right? So there's a lot of content that flew under the radar of automated forms of content curation and these human-driven policies that were imposed as a reaction to what was happening outside in the world. Users and the content that certain users posted still flew under the radar. We have additional analysis where we actually show that the users responsible for posting and disseminating this content, it's about 1% of the user base in the US. So it's really a tiny minority that generated most of this problematic content, and this minority flew under the radar of content moderation policies. All right, so I'm going to wrap up and we can start the Q&A. And I wanted to offer you a summary of the open questions that the field still confronts. And this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, mostly in terms of how AI-powered tools are going to complicate these challenges even more, and hopefully also give us some potential solutions, although I'm not particularly optimistic at this point in time. This journalist who writes for Science, Kai Kapfer-Schmidt, who published this very nice piece a few months ago now, where he sums up what the main challenges that researchers in this area are facing, what these challenges are. The first challenge he mentions is really about conceptualizing misinformation, right? Usually we operationalize this at what fact checkers label as false. And these, again, like the recent trend is that the main social media platforms are eliminating fact-checking programs. Now, there is a broader set of misleading content, or even content that is published by legitimate news outlets that have a certain type of framing that may result in distortions. And so even if they are not false news, or even if this content does not merit the label of false, it is still problematic and toxic and potentially damaging. And so the question is, how do we draw the line around content that we should be trying to control so that it's not damaging to elections or democratic processes? The second challenge is that everything, including research, is being politicized, definitely so in the context of the US. And so, again, how do we use the evidence that we produce without entering political territory, especially now, as I said, like this self-censoring happening right now. You cannot mention certain words if you want to get federal funding. And so that's an issue, not to mention the fact that scientific evidence is being contested as being fake as well. And so that's highly worrisome. The third difficulty is that it is difficult to determine the harms. And so we kind of the specific harms of problematic content, right? So we end up blaming all sorts of social problems on misinformation with little evidence, or with evidence that do not support those claims. There's a lot of correlation in this domain. There's very little causation that has been robustly identified by research. And so this is, also making it difficult to advance. There's a lot of noise, not too much signal. Fourth challenge, companies own the data, and this is far from ideal. Most of what I've told you today comes out of this unique and one-off collaboration with Meta that we started in the spring of 2020 ahead of the back then forthcoming elections, and there is not there's not going to be a continuation, not only with Meta, but with any other company of prominence. X is really opaque as well, and so without being able to access the data, we cannot analyze what happens on those platforms. And then, of course, the last problem is that this is, a problem that does not only affect the US. Obviously, it affects many other countries. And, the networks that are forming these platforms transcend boundaries. And the reality is that most of the research in this space is conducted in the global north, and particularly in Anglo-Saxon countries, and particularly in the US. And so we really have limits to, this imposes limits to how generalizable the results of research like the one I discussed are. I don't particularly have any definite answers to any of these questions. I'm hoping that some of you may have an answer to these questions, but maybe we can all think about these together during the Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen now, and maybe we can open the floor.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for this very nice talk. And now time for questions. Any question from the audience? Do you have any question? Well, in any case, I can start if you want, Sandra.
Yeah.
Well, first, I don't work in this field of computational social science and political communication. And the first time, in fact, I knew about your work was in 2023 when I read an article in El País newspaper saying that according to analysis of data from 208 million US citizens, 97% of fake news is seen by right-wing users, which was tackled in the first block of your talk. And I have two questions here, and I apologize in advance if these questions are too naive. So first, how can you know that one person reading, retweeting, or liking something is left or right-wing? How do you measure that? Is the process similar to the one performed by fact checkers? And well, I don't know if you prefer to answer first this question or as you want.
Yeah, so that I don't forget. And
go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's not, it's a good question. And of course, the argument relies on having a good way of classifying the ideological orientation of users, right? So we have a scale, and this is something that in political science, there's a lot of research on how to place individuals on the scale that goes from left to right or liberal conservative. And it's a continuum scale, right? It's not the so you can be more moderate or more extreme depending on how you get placed on that scale. In that particular paper that got covered by El País, so there's a classifier, a machine learning classifier that uses behavioral signals on the platform, such as, and these are not the only things, and we have all this information in the appendix to the paper, but essentially, depending on which news outlets you engage with the most or which pages you follow, you can infer the ideological inclination of users. But in addition to these behavioral signals, we also have for a subset of participants who agreed to answer survey questions, we also have their self-declared position, right? So people saying, I am leaning right or I'm leaning left. And there's a high correlation between the behavioral signals and the placement that people themselves kind of disclose, right? So we have high confidence in that classification. Now, of course, and again, the paper has all the details, but it's a continuous scale. And so there's different thresholds you can apply to decide if someone is left-leaning or right-leaning, right? So if this scale goes, imagine from -1 to 1, so are we going to split people around 0 or do we apply more extreme thresholds? And we use several of those to test the robustness of our findings. So it doesn't really, our conclusion doesn't really depend on the choice we make on how to define who's right-leaning or left-leaning. And in fact, the more attention you pay to the most extreme populations, right? So the ones that are really political and really clearly on the right or on the left, the starker these patterns become. So that's the answer to your question.
Okay, so a combination of machine learning and self-evaluation of their own ideology. Okay, great. And now what I'm going to say is highly controversial, but based on your results and analysis, especially from the first block of your presentation, could we say, based again on your results and analysis, could we say that conservative users have greater difficulty discriminating what is true from what is false?
So our research directly does not address this question, but that's why I cited other research in this talk that digs deeper into those kind of psychological or cognitive differences in terms of, who has more difficulty differentiating truth, and I don't want to have a very definite answer here because I know there's a kind of controversial conclusions from different studies, but what's certain is that audiences that are on average conservative gravitate to significantly more towards content that is considered false, both by professional fact checkers and by lay people who are instructed to evaluate that content, right? And so then the question becomes, so it's not a question, so, they can also identify truth from falsity, right? Like, so, but the question is, why are they gravitating more towards that type of content? And that's a question that can have a complicated answer, I think, but essentially it's a combination of it's content that tends to favor their policy positions, right? So there's some alignment there. It's also related to the machinery that generates that content, the media machine that is pumping that kind of content, which you may not have as prominently on the left, on the other side of the ideological continuum. So again, it's a matter of supply and demand. I will leave it there.
Okay, very good. Well, Christian Luna said, well, thank you for the talk. I have a quick question. Do you think platforms should be held responsible for how they design those algorithms?
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, yeah, accountable for sure, right? Like, so, and I really look favorably to what's happening in Europe in terms of the regulatory efforts and the DSA, the Digital Services Act, that's kind of encouraging or kind of forcing these platforms to be more transparent as to what their algorithms really do. I think it's very important to make any decision based on the best available evidence. And for that, we need to have access to those algorithmic systems to the best of our abilities, try to understand what the consequences of those algorithmic systems are. Because it's also true that there's a lot of lots of unfounded accusations, right? Humans self-select, right? It's not just that the algorithm is trapping us in echo chambers or that they are creating bubbles of like-minded people. We humans are also very prone to self-selecting into groups that think like us. Polarization is not a phenomenon that's created by technology. Technology amplifies that, but it doesn't create it. And so, yes, I think platforms should be held accountable for the things that they do wrong, but we first need to document what is it exactly that they're doing wrong, right? And so, and that requires access to data so that we can generate evidence so that we can advocate for evidence-based regulations or penalties or, but we need the data and we need to be able to document exactly what they are doing wrong. Because again, as we show in our papers, it's individual people who decide to post certain types of content, right? And so platforms sometimes get stuck in a situation where they have to protect the freedom of speech while also preventing damaging content from circulating. And they have legal obligations, definitely, in the US, but they have legal obligations, and sometimes it's very difficult to walk that line, right? And but people should also take responsibility for what they do in these platforms. And so freedom of speech doesn't equal freedom of reach, right? You have a right to express your voice, but that doesn't mean that platforms should give you should amplify your reach. And so this is where I think platforms have a responsibility. But again, I think we need more data so that we can inform our regulatory efforts with the best available evidence.
Thank you very much for the answer and the question. Any other question? Oscar Cordon, please. Oscar, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much, Sandra. It was a great talk. I really enjoyed it a lot. My question is pretty similar. I mean, pretty related to the last one. I'm most focused on research. So you have been working, you are a computational social scientist, you have been working, and you mentioned it in the dilemmas at the end of your talk. So you need data. Data belongs to the companies, and it's not related in this case to the regulatory issues that are even over that. But in order to develop your research, you need such data. Up to now, you have been working with companies and you have signed agreements with them to develop your research. But now, all the social media platforms are closed, even for teaching, for any kind. I teach social network analysis and social media mining here at the University of Granada. So even for the practice work, for the degree students and the master students, we are experiencing problems. Even for small scrapers as for Spotify and these issues where we usually get very, very small amounts of data. So how do you guess that this will be affecting, because it's so politicized, as you mentioned before? How will we as researchers get affected, and are you forecasting any kind of improvement of this situation in the short future?
Yeah, I mean, I think one reason why it is becoming increasingly difficult to access data is not just because platforms want to avoid any sort of responsibility, but also because of AI, right? Data and having data that can train the next, model. I mean, Reddit has shut down its API. I mean, lots of platforms, not just the evil, quote unquote, the evil ones. One platform that gives me reason to be optimistic is Blue Sky, which I have students who are analyzing the data. So it is the one platform that is growing, and not only making it easy to collect data, but also to create your own feed, right? Sort of if you don't like what you get on the feed, you can create your own news feed, and there's so many already, right? And so to me, this is fascinating, not only because it goes back to the original model of the open web, or that's how they think of themselves, actually, right? Like, there's a more sarcastic vision of Blue Sky that I could give, but I'm not going to do it today. They are trying to go back to the open web. They think of themselves as a portal to the web. They do not downrank news, like Meta, Facebook did some time ago, of demoting news content, the URLs that would go to news outlets. And I mean, they just see themselves as a gateway to the web. They are decentralized in the sense that, in practice, they are quite centralized because all the accounts are in the Blue Sky servers, and that's posing a huge cost on them. So the question is, how would they pay for it if they don't use advertising? But that's their problem, not ours, right? And so in theory, anybody could create their own server and host, but it's also decentralized from the interface perspective, in the sense that it gives users the ability to build something if they believe that the platform is not offering them. So we shouldn't just complain that we don't like our feed. Let's do something about it, and you can create your own algorithm. And so, and this combination of things, it's, I think there's a lot of research papers that will soon be written using Blue Sky data, for instance. And I think this is one immediate way of thinking about your students and your PhD projects. Certainly my students are thinking about it. The other is historical archives, right? So, I mean, Reddit there's 20 years of Reddit data. I have a few projects on that. And there's a lot of stuff to be learned also from, it's a little bit like archaeology of the internet, but it's still relevant to the extent that there's a lot of lessons learned using those 20 years of data and growth and how, different subreddits have different rules and governance and whatever, right? There's a lot of stuff we can learn that can be transported to current technologies up and coming, like fundamental questions of research or how networks grow and evolve. And so, that's the other avenue that I'm thinking about. But I do believe also that people are getting I have faith in the new generations and in their ability to innovate and go back to other models that are not the walled garden kind of vision of the internet. And so I think more apps will grow with these open protocols, infrastructures that Blue Sky represents at the moment better than anybody else. But I think there's going to be other platforms and other technologies that are going to, or Mastodon is another example, right? The federated. But so I think there's reason to be optimistic, but and I think we should focus our energies on those possibilities instead of keep on complaining about everything that's we can also exit, X and Meta and exit those platforms. They are nothing without us, right? We have power as individuals, and network effects are powerful. You need collective action of sorts, but Blue Sky is an example that it works, that you can get this migration of users from one platform to another if you stop being happy with what they offer or how they use your data, right? Not sure if this is fully
definitely. Thank you so much. Pretty optimistic way, so a view, so I like it so much. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks.
Well, thank you very much for the question and the answer. Any other question from the audience? Last chance, because otherwise we can hear this DaSCI seminar. Any other question?
Now or never, nah.
Exactly. Well, okay, so I think we can thank again Professor González-Bailón. Thank you very much, Sandra, for this very interesting talk. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and let's keep in touch.
Let's do it. Gracias a vosotros.
Gracias.
Chao, chao.
Chao, chao.